Deer don't recognize the human outline easily until you stand up and get on 2 feet. When you're low to the ground like that, you look like a tree stump. You don't look like a human. It's a completely different profile, and deer don't recognize it as much.
I love the ground hunting conversation because some people, maybe they don't have it in the budget this year to get a tree stand or a saddle, or they're tired of lugging one around and they want to try out ground hunting just as another tool to be more versatile. And you said you gave up the tree stand, what, like 18 years ago?
I gave the tree stand up 18 years ago, and I'm 67, so I gave it up at 49 years of age. 18 years of hunting on the ground, and I've killed my best deer, biggest deer, during that 18-year period of hunting on the ground. I've been more successful hunting off the ground than I ever was hunting out of a tree stand. I think it benefits you, actually, a lot. It's taxing to carry a heavy tree stand around in the woods. I can see a tree stand being really beneficial to people that hunt in low hills or flat ground, you know, because it's a lot easier to get busted. But when you're hunting in the mountains and you're hunting above, in the mornings, like I do, above the sign that you're hunting on, you're above that sign, you've got the thermals to your advantage, you're uphill above the deer that are coming in, so it's kind of like you're in a tree stand without being in a tree stand, you know? What I like to try and do, and also comfort has a whole lot to do with how observant you are when you're hunting. When you're up in a tree stand, I don't know how y'all feel in a saddle or a tree stand, but I always felt slightly uncomfortable. They're just not the most comfortable things in the world to sit in. What I use is just a ground turkey lounger. You know, it's got a full back in it. It sits low to the ground. I'll have, in open woods, I'll have does walk within 5 yards of me and not realize what I am as long as I don't move. I think deer don't recognize the human outline easily until you stand up and get on 2 feet. When you're low to the ground like that, you look like a tree stump. You don't look like a human. It's a completely different profile, and deer don't recognize it as much. Now, if everybody started ground hunting, that might change the game. But I think right now I'm a rarity, not the majority of people. But if you can't afford a tree stand for some reason right now, don't feel like you have to have one. You can be successful off of the ground. You just have to use the elements to your advantage. A lot of times when you set up on the ground, you can look for, you know, erosion happens a lot in the mountains. You know, when you've got a big tree on the side of a mountain, a lot of times erosion will pile up ground on the backside of that tree and create a flat spot. That is a perfect place to set a tree lounger or a ground turkey lounger, you know. Scrape a few rocks out of the way with your feet, do what you got to clear the area. And I like to sit behind the tree when I'm gun hunting. Bow hunting, it's a little more difficult, but if you are using a compound or you are using a recurve or a longbow, you can still sit behind that tree. What I used to like to do when I was compound hunting is I would lean my compound up against the side of the tree and sit behind the tree. And when a deer came into the area, being up high above the sign, I was always able to see the deer before the deer ever saw me. And that enabled me and bought me enough time to get set up on the deer before the deer came into the area. And then with the tree behind you, get used to shooting from a sitting position, or leave enough room behind the tree to where you can have that tree as wide as you are and get down on your knees and kneel and practice shooting from a prone position. Because I think if you try and do that sideways and practice compound shooting or recurve shooting or longbow shooting like that, I think you'll find that when you do that and you're on your feet and your knees, you've got 4 points of contact on the ground instead of 2 points on the contact on the ground. When you're standing up sideways to a target and you draw on it and you try to remain steady, your body swaggers back and forth like this. When you got 4 points of contact on the ground, that swagger is not nearly as exaggerated. don't make your bow so heavy in weight. Just draw enough weight that you're comfortable with it. What's more important is that you can hold your bow for 2 minutes drawn if you have to. And still, shoot 50 pounds, shoot 55 pounds, shoot just enough to where you've got enough kinetic energy at an efficient range, at 30, 35, 40 yards to still get a pass-through lung shot on that deer, The blood trail may not be as easy to follow as a deer that is shot from a downward angle out of a tree stand, because when you do that, you've got a low exit hole. That blood is going to fill up to that low exit hole in those lungs, and then it's going to start exiting. Until it reaches that hole, the blood is probably not going to leave much of a trail. Well, when you're shooting at a deer that is a little more on level ground with you, if you're hunting on level ground, on the ground, your shot may be perfectly level when you shoot the deer. And so it may take a while for that blood to build up to that hole. So really pay attention when you're ground hunting on level ground to the direction that deer runs off to. Carry a compass with you, okay? A compass with a rotatable index. Learn how to use it, Point that compass north, the needle, get the needle pointing north, and then turn that arrow dial to the direction in the tree where you last saw that deer. And then when you get up and you move to a different location, use that compass to keep pointing you in that direction, that general direction where that deer went, so that you don't know, because sometimes you may have to walk for 100 yards before you find first blood because it had to fill up to that level hit before it started really exiting from the lungs. But once it gets up to that level, I don't think you're going to have a hard time finding the trail, because once it starts coming out of both those holes at the same time, it's going to be everywhere. It's going to be plastered on every piece of vegetation on either side of that deer where it ran. It's going to be a lot easier to find that blood trail if you mark with the compass where you need to look. Because like I say, you may have to go a ways before you can find that blood. And you owe it to that animal to give every effort possible to try and recover that deer,
I think one thing that intimidates folks when it comes to hunting on the ground, whether it's bow hunting or rifle hunting, is just staying concealed and not being busted when they're on the ground. So what are some rules of thumb? Like you mentioned one right there, like try to sit behind the tree, try to be above the deer. Are there any other rules of thumb that you have about staying concealed?
Yes, if you use any kind of ground vegetation to your cover, or to your advantage. If you've got some ground cover around, you can take a few branches and set around the tree around you, not so high up to the point, or if that you can't shoot over it. Or if you've got one of those screw-in tree umbrellas or something like that, they can be staked into the ground to where you can use it as a blind in front of the tree that you're sitting behind. If you can't sit behind a tree, look for a fallen tree. Get in the crown of that tree. If you've got a tree, parallel to the ridge and you're wanting to hunt, downhill from that tree, if it's a big enough tree and it's fallen over, you might not have to sit in the crown of the tree. You might be able to just sit right behind that tree to where the only thing that's seen is your head. And I would highly advise that you always wear gloves and you always wear a head net. If you're not going to wear a head net, at least paint your face, because I think deer pick out light colors pretty easily, especially for somebody like Jacob.
I come built in with my own blaze orange right here.
Built-in blaze.
Yeah. I was going to ask if you do any like ghillie suit or leaf suit or anything like that.
Yes, a leafy suit. Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. Yeah, I usually
you wear that
during the early season when I'm bow hunting. Yeah, I'll usually carry a light leafy suit. It's like an over leafy suit. I'll wear just plain camo underneath, carry the leafy suit in my backpack, and then when I go to set up and get where I'm going, then I put the leafy suit on, because the leafy suits, they easily get torn by briars and things like that you pass through. So if you want to make it last for a while, stick it inside your backpack, carry it in. Then when you get to where you're hunting, then throw that thing on before you sit down and you start hunting once you found the location that you want to hunt in. So yeah, a leafy suit works wonders. Breaks your outline really, really well. If you're hunting close to the top of the ridge, make sure you're down far enough to where you've got some mountain behind your back if you're hunting in the mountains, Don't hunt to where you can be skylined easily. You got to stay down off the top of the ridge. Even if the sign is really great up there, stay down far enough to where you don't get silhouetted by the skyline from deer looking uphill. You have to keep that in mind, just as you do as a tree stand hunter. You don't want to be skylined. Like I said, you use natural cover to your advantage. The thing that's great about the turkey seat, like if you're sitting on the top of a ridge looking onto a circular trail that's going around one of these saddles, you don't necessarily have to have a tree. A lot of times in these saddles, you can just find brushy cover that you can tuck back into and just prune a couple of limbs if you have to, just to get that shooting lane right out in front of you when the deer circles around. Just be innovative and just use whatever you see around you to your advantage. If it's not a big tree, it needs to be something. Otherwise, you're going to get busted when you draw. Exception to the rule, if you don't have anything to put around you and a deer comes in and you're not prepared, wait for the deer to put its head down. Wait for the deer to get its head preferably behind a tree or something so that you can get drawn, because that's what's going to give you away, is just going through that drawing motion. Once you've got that bow drawn, as long as you're not pulling 90 pounds to where you're doing this, as long as you know what your manageable weight is and what you can handle, and hold steady for a couple of minutes, you're not going to get busted. All you got to do is just wait for that animal to step out away from that tree, and then you've got that open shot.
Is there anything that you do vastly different if you're setting up, say, on a steep hill and you're looking down at where you think the deer are going to be, versus if you're hunting something like one of those ridge flats where maybe you're more eye level with where the deer are going to be?
Well, with the ridge flats, usually they're not that wide in most of the places that I hunt. They might be in some places that I haven't found yet, and if they did, I would probably hunt on the back side of the flat, right where the mountain starts to, take its uphill plunge, But for a narrow flat, I'd hunt it like I do a bench. I would stay above it on the higher ground so that I don't have any scent pulling in the area of that flat, and I would have the thermal advantage as well as a sight advantage. If I'm up higher, odds are if a deer is walking that flat, I'm going to see it sooner than if I'm sitting down on the level with it. So I would always prefer to be a little bit above in level in any hunting scenario, any situation if possible.
That makes sense.
Also, when you're ground hunting, one thing I've learned about ground hunting for deer is it's very similar to turkey hunting, where I can get caught up, like when I'm up in the tree and like in the saddle, I can get caught up like, I'll play on my phone for a little bit, whatever. One thing I've learned ground hunting, both deer and turkey, if you think you're in the game, it slows down. Like, you really can't do that because your movement's so much exaggerated on the ground because you're eye level with a deer.
Yeah, it is.
Do you do anything specifically about mentally being focused? Like, how do you focus on being focused when sitting on the ground and always having your eyes moving around and not trying to get distracted? I mean,
well, first of all, I'm legally blind in my left eye. I was born that way, and so it's hard for me to cover my left-hand side, without actually having to turn my head, But when I'm on the ground, I'm turning my head and moving most of the time. You just have to do it slow as molasses. Don't make quick, jerky movements. And as far as just being prepared to do that and to have what it takes to force yourself to be in that mental scenario, a lot of that is pounding it into your head. Talk to yourself, make notes, write it down over and over. Don't just write it once, write it again and again and again. Things that you write down tend to stay in your subconscious mind. Practice the scenario. When you're at home and you're out shooting in your backyard, practice moving slow. Don't move fast. Practice it any chance you get, and that's going to make it more comfortable and more natural for you to do. Second thing, get a good night's rest. If you don't get a good night's rest, your mind is not 100% in the game. I think if you find that you've eaten well, you've been nourished well, and you've gotten a good night's rest, you You may have to sacrifice a little bit of hunting time to get a good night's rest, but it's worth it because that way you can concentrate and keep your mind in the game for the time that you are out there hunting, and I think that's a lot more important.
Yeah, that's excellent. Also, when ground hunting, do you do anything different when it comes to taking a rifle or muzzleloader out versus when you're bow hunting?
Yes. I mean, I feel it's a whole lot more forgiving. You know, most of the places that I hunt in the mountains, if I see a deer, usually I'm going to see it more than 100 yards away coming to me. And by the time it's there, it's dead. You know, I'm a pretty good shot. And so I don't usually miss, you know, and if I did, I'm going to catch it from my oldest son. So I can't afford to miss. I don't want to hear it. And he don't want to hear it from me either because I'll do the same thing to him. So I just relax a little bit. When I'm gun hunting on the ground, I don't usually bother wearing a head net. I still wear gloves, you know, because you're going to have to pull that gun up. But the deer are farther away. It's much less likely that they're going to recognize your face, especially if you have any type of beard growth that's natural like y'all guys do. Grow a beard during hunting season. It will definitely pay benefits, you know, especially if you're pale skinned, you know. But that's really the difference mainly is, you know, I still try and move very slowly. I still try and set up my stand if I can behind a tree. And what I'll usually do is I'll lean my muzzleloader or my gun right on the back side of that tree right there. And the reason why I like to be behind a tree is a lot of times, you know, if you see a deer a little farther than 100 yards away, 150 yards, whatever, and you have to make that shot, you know, you can stand, if that tree's wider than you are, it's real easy to stand up behind that tree, grab your gun, slide it around the side of the tree, you know, and use that tree as a rest to steady your shot so you can make those long-range shots without having to do it offhand and risk missing the shot, you know. Get a rest if you can get it, you know. Anytime there's any kind of a rest, when you're rifle hunting, take it, you know. The first 5 years that I came up and had to relearn hunting the mountains, I spent a lot of time walking with a tree stand on my back and never hanging a tree stand on a tree all day long. Just walking and educating myself and trying to put together the pieces of why these trails existed in these areas. You know, asking yourself the why. A lot of times the why is really important. You know, the where is important too, but the why can be important, you know. And that's one great thing about y'all's podcast is that I had to spend 5 years roaming around in the mountains trying to figure all this stuff out. If people will listen to y'all's podcast on a regular basis, the increase in the learning curve could be really substantial. But still, when you get started, I can't stress how important it is to spend more time scouting than you do hunting. If you spend 2 to 3 times as much time scouting as you do hunting, and hunt on the best days, hunt when that cold weather comes through, hunt when those deer want to move, go out and scout during those warm days when the deer movement is not as good. You know, don't waste your time. Make your days effective. Make them count. You know, and spend that time in the off-season scouting, you know, trying to figure things out and put 2 and 2 together. And if you do that, I think your learning curve to success is going to be a much shorter amount of time than what it took for me having to learn everything myself. Now we can go on to the ground.
And I appreciate that too. And also, I mean, we say it all the time that the podcast can help you shorten your learning curve, but there's no silver bullet. At the end of the day, you still got to go burn the boot leather and figure it out for yourself. We can just help you get, you know,
exactly
a good place to start.
What works for one person might not necessarily work for somebody else. You're going to find a lot of different theories on the show and a lot of different attitudes and methods toward how they go about things, you know,